I was recently asked about what it was like training in Jukendo in the early 90s. First thing to say is that this was over 30 years ago, so my memory of training is far from perfect. In fact, I will go so far as to say I have forgotten more than I remember. This is not just due to the time gap, but also back then I was training pretty intensely in a variety of martial systems, including Aikido, Judo, Shingi Bagua, and Shinto Mosu Ryujo. Generally, I was in class twice a day and pretty much all day Sunday, so Jukendo was just one of a mix of martial systems I was doing. How did I start Jukendo? By chance, my wife, girlfriend back then, and I moved into an apartment in Tokyo, 20 yards from where Mike Scott was living. If you don't know about Mike, then look him up, especially the work he and Diane Scott did with Koryu books. Anyway, it was one of those chance happenings that has deeply, positively affected our lives. So we soon became friends, starting with when I began training with him in Shinto Muso Ryujo under Phil Relnick. Some months later, Mike told me about the International Budo Seminar in Katsura, and that I should go with him and Diane, and also try out Jukendo at one of the new Budo sessions that was being held there. Well, I did, and enjoyed it, but felt nothing more than, well, that was cool. However, after I returned to Tokyo, Mike then suggested I join him and Diane and begin training at the Budokan, one of the small dojos that exist in Jukendo, at the morning sessions they were doing. To be honest, I was not overly excited, but I was free in the mornings when they trained and I enjoyed Mike and Diane's company, and so thought, why not? So, with permissions received from Wakimoto Sensei, who I had met at the International Budo Seminar, I started training in Jukendo under. I can't remember anything about the first few months of training. I must have borrowed Bogu and a Mokuju and been shown how to wear everything, but I have zero recollection of this. Within a month or two, I got my own Bogu, which I have used for the last 30 years or more, despite most of it not really fitting properly, nor being of much quality. I have now replaced nearly everything except my kata-ate, my ude bukuro, the glove, my oda buton, and of course my mokuju. I kind of like having some of the stuff I used to use back when I first started. It connects me a little to that time. So, about Jukendo training back then, at least what I can remember. Our main teacher was Wakimoto Sensei, but some of the other teachers would also join the class to teach, including Kodahara Sensei, Yasunaga Sensei, and Ito Sensei. Sometimes Kia Sensei, Wakimoto Sensei's teacher, would come down to the dojo dressed up in his bogu and hang around. I can't remember if he actually taught us anything or was just present. Of course, the teaching was in Japanese, and back then my Japanese was even poorer than today. So it was much about listening and watching very carefully. Mike would occasionally translate, but I think he felt, quite rightly, that we should improve our Japanese and not rely on him. Also, when you don't understand what is actually being said, you do end up watching much more carefully. So maybe it was not a bad thing. Training was for an hour or so, I think, in the mornings, and the majority of that time was focused on Kihon, Chokototsu, and more Chokototsu. It would drive me crazy and was really boring. We didn't do it as we practice today, that is to say, 3 times and change. That was only how we would finish practice. Instead, we basically did it for the length of the dojo and then back again, up and down the dojo. It was just repetition and more repetition of the same techniques. Then maybe we would switch to Dattotsu and continue, again and again. Then Renzoku if Wakimoto Sensei felt like we needed a break. Of course, over time, more of the Jukendo syllabus was taught to us, including kata and shiai geiko. However, my overriding memory of this time is repeatedly doing Kihon. Now, there were several reasons for this. The obvious being that this is what we needed to learn first. But the bigger reason was, even back then, Makimoto Sensei and the team were keen that when we left Japan, we would propagate Jukendo into the wider world. And he, rather like Sato Sensei now, wanted us to do pure, straightforward Jukendo. Nothing weird, nothing that varied from the most standard and correct way of doing Jukendo. To give some more context, they saw back then that even in Japan, the level of Jukendo was not always great. That some places and teachers were doing things differently and not really following the line of how Jukendo should be practiced and taught. Some of it was old-fashioned and out of date. Some of it was all about Shiai and how to win. Let me expand on this last point. I remember Mike asking about why we were not being encouraged to compete and seemed to be focusing just on the Kihon instead. Wakimoto Sensei was adamant that Shiai can actually damage your Jukendo, especially in one's early years of training. It can make Jukendo something less than the Budo it's meant to be, leading to bad habits in both technique and attitude. He didn't elaborate much more than that, but I can see this now, what an overemphasis on Shiai can do to one's Jukendo. Back to Kihon and the emphasis that Wakimoto Sensei put on it. A massive point for him, and something I still struggle with, is how he explained the proper body dynamics for doing Chokototsu. Kuwahara Sensei was excellent in talking about the relaxed arms and hands, but Wakimoto Sensei emphasized how to shift your hips, your tandem, into the thrust and then return it, pull the mokuju back. It is a thrust with a fumikomi where the feet stay close to the ground, and as you land on your relaxed knees, you move or drive your hip forward, moving your weight over the front leg. By far, Diane got this way of doing the technique fast. She would move her hips and waist wonderfully, adding power and reach to her technique, while keeping her arms and hands relaxed. Mike and I struggled to do this to the level Wakimoto Sensei wanted. This way of doing the basic thrust is an exquisite and very nuanced shift in body dynamics, a way to bring relaxed power and reach to one's technique. On some more points and things I remember. During this time training, there was lots of discussion about how they could make Jukendo more popular. Now remember, some of the people involved in Jukendo back then had fought in the Second World War. Certainly Kia Sensei, but also I think Otsu Sensei. There were other teachers I met, including the only 10th dan in Jukendo, Sasaki Sensei, I think. And although they were wonderful men, the history of Jukendo in the war was still something tangible and part of the collective psyche of Japan and also the Jukendo Reme. We were still wearing the old military uniforms, and the commands were slightly different and generally shouted and delivered like military commands. The whole system was simply more militaristic and connected to World War II. This was also clear in the techniques too, which were bigger, more robust, and it still had some sense of that battlefield feel to them. This was Jukendo at a pivotal point, something that could be used on the battlefield, but now needed to be available and acceptable to modern, non-military Japanese citizens. All sorts of things were beginning to be tried, including rubber covers for the rifle butt, I guess to stop the sound of the butt striking the ground when moving back from kamae, rubber stoppers for the hand position. Now we use tape, and I think they were also thinking about uniform changes, but this eventually happened after I left Japan. Wakimoto Sensei was clear to us that this was not Jukendo Kakuto fighting, and instead Jukendo, something fit for the modern world. Over time, we had others joining our training, including one day Ogawa Sensei. I can't remember quite when or how long he trained with us, but we shared some time and instruction. I do remember Wakimoto Sensei giving him a really hard time, something we still laugh about now. Of course, I did begin to enjoy the training and started to progress. But beyond that was after the sessions, where we would hang out in the office, drink some tea, and talk and listen to the sensei as they began to work. Work which seemed to mainly consist of writing out Jukendo and Tankendo certificates. At that time, Eto-san had also joined as a member of the Renmei after graduating from Katsuya University. Just a few years younger than I, this is when I started building my relationship with him. A final thought. Of course, all the older sensei of today know much of what I have written here. Possibly the difference is I left Japan at the end of the 90s and was not part of the evolution and changes that took place over the next 15 years in Jukendo. I was doing Jukendo, teaching a handful of individuals, still wearing my white uniform and using a mokuju with a black tampon, the rubber at the end of the mokuju, blissfully ignorant of the changes and developments that were happening. I was caught in time, anachronistic, old-fashioned, but doing what I'd learned. Now it's catch-up. There are still habits, such as a double ki when doing halai techniques and other old-fashioned things I do, but possibly I'm catching back up to Jukendo and how it was done in the 21st century.